Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Rival Napoleons, Stalinism and Bonapartism by a David Lockwood. I don't know who David Lockwood is. This article is originally from 2002. Quote, there's another form of reaction, called Bonapartism. Bonapartism is the necessary form of state in a country where the working class, at a high level of development in the towns but numerically inferior to the small peasants in rural areas, has been defeated in a great revolutionary struggle by the capitalist class, the petty bourgeoisie, and the army. End quote. Engels, the Prussian military question and the German Workers' Party. February 1865. After Stalin's death in 1953, Isaac Deutscher noted that the Russian Revolution had been unique among the modern revolutions in not giving rise to a military dictatorship. Quote, but, he said, quote, the ghost of Bonaparte has haunted it for 3 decades, end quote. Footnote, see Deutscher's article, Bonapartism in the Soviet Union, published in Russia, China, and the West, a Contemporary Chronicle, 1953 to 1966. End footnote. And it was true from the earliest days. During 1917, Petrograd and Moscow were abuzz with speculation on the Russian Napoleon. Would it be Kornilov or Kerensky? Would the Bolsheviks themselves play the role, or lay the foundations for the man on a white horse? No sooner were the Bolsheviks in power than the book was opened on how long it would take for their regime to succumb to the militarized fate of the other, quote, modern revolutions. Consolidation of Bolshevik power by no means put an end to the discussion of Bonapartism, though this was now transferred from the popular domain to the higher councils of the party leadership. From the end of the Civil War onwards, the party seems to have been constantly fearful of Bonapartism, and therefore engaged in a continual heresy hunt against it. First, there was Trotsky, an obvious candidate for the part, were it not for the fact that his Marxist politics led him to reject emphatically any use of the armed forces against the regime, despite his increasing alienation from it. Next came Marshal Tukhachevsky, accused at the Bukharin trial, after his own trial and execution, of Bonapartist tendencies so pronounced that even his alleged fellow conspirators were disturbed by them. Footnote, see Bukharin's testimony on the 7th of March 1938 in People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR, report of the court proceedings in the case of the anti-Soviet, quote, block of rights and Trotskyites, end quote. People's Commissariat of Justice, 1938. And footnote. Marshal Zhukov, following his triumphs in the Great Patriotic War, was demoted in 1945 and threatened by the security organs in 1947. Lavrenti Beria, arrested and executed in the wake of Stalin's death, was accused of Bonapartist ambitions by the dictator's putative successors, perhaps on the basis of the Interior Ministry's private armies. As late as 1957, Marshal Zhukov, having risen after Stalin's death, was removed from the leadership ranks of the party/state with the charge of Bonapartism ringing in his ears. Bonapartism, then, was one of the most persistent labels which the Soviet regime attached to its enemies, and if the label meant anything, it would seem to be something that the regime feared genuinely and continuously. Even today, the question of the post-Soviet government's relationship with the military remains an open one. From the failed military coup of 1991 to the ostentatious display of military power in Chechnya in 1999. But was the party's concern a legitimate concern? This article will investigate what Bonapartism is and was, starting from the definition used by Marx and Engels. It will then consider whether there was an actual Bonapartist threat to the Soviet regime, and if there was, why it existed and why it persisted. New section, Bonapartism. Engels' general definition of Bonapartism is given at the beginning of this article. In 1884, Engels wrote that when, quote, the warring classes balance each other, end quote, the state can become an independent force, quote, such was the Bonapartism of the first and still more of the second French Empire, end quote. It was to the latter that Marx had turned his attention in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, 1852. Oh, and I feel like I fucked up that article. In 1884, Engels wrote that when, quote, the warring classes balance each other, end quote, the state can become an independent force, quote, such was the Bonapartism of the first and still more of the second French Empire, end quote. It was to the latter that Marx had turned his attention in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, 1852. I have a piece on here from Hal Draper's Volume 1, of Karl Marx's theory of revolution, state and bureaucracy. I have a chapter on Bonapartism, and it's kind of a breakdown of the key insights of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Under the regime of Louis Napoleon, Marx said, quote, "The state seems to have made itself completely independent," end quote, from both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It was supported by, quote, "the most numerous class of French society, the small holding peasants, end quote. Marx. Footnote. As was Napoleon I, see Georges Roudet, Revolutionary Europe, 1873 to 1815. End footnote. Since the latter, quote, "cannot represent themselves," the small holding peasants, their representative must at the same time appear as their master, as an authority over them, end quote. Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Such a regime is consequently a military regime, quote, "the culminating point of the, quote, idée Napoleonienne, idée Napoleonienne, is the preponderance of the army," end quote. 18th Brumaire. The military themselves, having been called upon so often to restore order, had an interest in, quote, "saving society once and for all by proclaiming their own regime," end quote. At that point, quote, "all classes equally impotent and equally mute fall on their knees before the rifle butt," end quote. 18th Brumaire. Such was the concept of Bonapartism for Marx and Engels. The state is an independent power raised above bourgeoisie and proletariat, based on the peasantry and assuming the form of a military dictatorship. It was not a term designed to describe each and every form of state dictatorship, but the base and the manifestation of Bonapartism were crucial to the Marxist concept. Were that not the case, then dozens of 20th century state-dominated regimes could be labeled, quote, Bonapartist, thus rendering the term meaningless. In the search of historical materialism, in the terms of historical materialism, state-dominated systems represent economic structures in which production relations are dominated by the state. Footnote. For the state is a production relation rather than as a part of the superstructure, see David Lockwood's The Destruction of the Soviet Union, A Study in Globalization, published in 2000. End footnote. Such economic structures are similar in that they are dominated by the state's preoccupations, defense and expansion, but they can receive support from a variety of classes. The peasantry and the state bureaucracy are only two examples. Only those supported by the peasantry, however, can properly be called, quote, Bonapartist. New section, the early Soviet period. In the early Soviet period, Bonapartism was invoked more often as a chronological likelihood than anything else. Both the English and French revolutions, after a period of radicalism, had been followed by a military dictatorship. The Bolsheviks represented the extreme radical edge of the Russian Revolution. Military rule was bound to follow. Footnote. See Dmitry Shlapentok, The Counter-Revolution in Revolution, Images of Thermidor and Napoleon at the Time of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, published in 1999. End footnote. Such a view was not inspired by a materialist analysis of the Russian situation. It was simply a case of ahistorical analogy. This did not prevent it from achieving a certain popularity within leading Bolshevik circles, however, particularly when it could be used to preempt any leadership aspirations on the part of Leon Trotsky. Footnote. See Isaac Deutscher, Stalin, A Political Biography, and John Gooding, Rulers and Subjects, Government and People in Russia, 1801 to 1991, published in 1996. In footnote. Marxism was more evident in the Mensheviks' analysis, which pointed out that it was the bourgeois nature of the Russian Revolution that made it analogous with those of England and France. Under Bolshevik leadership in the cities and towns, the revolution had overreached itself. It would inevitably be dragged back from its, quote, socialist pretensions into correspondence with the actual level of development of the productive forces in Russia. It was likely that a military regime based on the peasantry would do the dragging. Most perceptively of all, The Mensheviks understood that it was the Bolsheviks themselves who were nurturing the military threat within the regime. In his last major article on party policy, written from exile in 1922, Martov warned against the, quote, counter-revolutionary danger maturing within the military and bureaucratic apparatus which the Bolsheviks themselves have created, the danger of a Bonapartist completion of the Red dictatorship, which having pitilessly disinherited the toiling masses, would put a new Russian bourgeoisie in a privileged position. End quote. Martov. Footnote, see Israel Getzler, Martov, A Political Biography of a Russian Social Democrat. I have a chapter from that book on this channel. End footnote. Also on like the Bonapartism in this period, or potential Bonapartism, check out the pieces by the Council Communist Willy Hun, Trotsky's Bonapartism, on this channel. Carrying on. As well as being one of the first accused of Bonapartist tendencies, Trotsky was also among the first to turn the accusation against his detractors. During the Civil War, Trotsky had been quick to dismiss fears of Bonapartism as expressed by the remaining socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks for two reasons. I don't know if it's going to say this, but just a side note for myself. There's an important trial. I can't remember what the guy's fucking name was. I'm about to read an article on it by Rabinowitz. But it's about kind of like, not, I don't know if you necessarily call it a show trial, because I don't think it was like kind of had like the public face that it did, like the show trials did. But it was like a trial against like a commander of the Baltic Fleet during the Civil War that Trotsky accused of having Bonapartist tendencies, that was ultimately shot. This was like in 1920. I'm not sure what that person's name was, but I wonder if I'm curious if it's going to be referenced here. Anyway, back to the text. The first reason, put forward in a letter to Izvestia on the first day of the 8th Party Congress, was the huge presence of Communist Party members within the armed forces. This prevented, quote, Bonapartism, bracket, arising, end bracket, from the soil of Revolutionary War, end quote. Footnote. See Francesco Benvenuti, The Bolsheviks and the Red Army, 1918 to 1922, published in 1988. End footnote. The second reason expressed in Trotsky's theses on the military question written for the same Congress was that, quote, Bonapartism is not a product of military organization as such, but a product of particular social relations, end quote. In Russia, it would be based on the kulaks. The Red Army could not give rise to Bonapartism, Trotsky asserted, because, quote, kulaks are excluded and driven out, end quote, of the Red Army's ranks. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, Thesis 18, in Theses adopted by the 8th Party Congress, March 1919, published in the Military Writings of Leon Trotsky, Volume 1. End footnote. In reality, this was theoretical sleight of hand on Trotsky's part. It was not the argument of Marx and Engels that a Bonapartist regime consisted of peasants, only that it had their support. In any case, Trotsky's picture of a kulak-free Red Army was a false one. Footnote. A majority of the Red Army came from peasant families at this time. Those peasant families who could afford to let their sons join up were the better off ones, who would in time be denounced as kulaks. For the continuing concern of the regime about kulak influence in the army, see the reports of the Military Political Administration, PURKKA, on the struggle against kulaks in the Red Army, 1929 to 30, Fond 9, this is like an archive, Russian Military State Archive, Moscow. Some kind of, I don't know what the words they were using there were, so I just skipped over them. But you get the idea. Anyway, Trotsky also maintained at this time that Bonapartism could only succeed, quote, as a result of a direct and open bloody victory, end quote, over the Soviet regime, which was only possible with the support of imperialism of one sort or another. 8 years later, not unnaturally, Trotsky's view had changed dramatically. Trotsky was no longer defending the regime, but warning it against the results of its own degeneration. Called before the Central Control Commission in July 1927, Trotsky was accused of making a factional speech to the Comintern executive and participating in an opposition demonstration. Brushing the formal accusation aside, Trotsky invoked the fate of the French Revolution against his accusers. The Thermidorians of France, Trotsky said, had emerged not as open counter-revolutionaries, but from the right wing of the Jacobins. It was they who laid the basis for Napoleon's rise to power, and who became the functionaries of Napoleon's regime. Quote, "We should learn from the French Revolution," end quote, Trotsky concluded. Quote, "But is it really necessary to repeat it?" End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Leon Trotsky, 2 speeches at the session of the Central Control Commission. Published in The Stalin School of Falsification, Pathfinder Press, 1971. End footnote. Trotsky's first real application of the concept to the Soviet situation came in his article, The Danger of Bonapartism, written in October 1928. At this time, Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet system divided into 3 parts. On the left are the workers and sometimes the poor peasants and those who represented their interests, the opposition. On the right lurked the rich peasants and the new economic policy men. Their representatives were Bukharin and the rightists. Balancing in the middle was the economic, political, and military bureaucracy with Stalin and Stalin supporters at their head. The right, backed by the kulaks, was the source of potential Bonapartism. In this article, The Danger of Bonapartism, Trotsky maintains the form of the Marxist concept, but dispenses with the content. On the one hand, Bonapartism would take the form of a, quote, supreme and purely military concentration of power, rising, quote, above all classes, end quote, which would manifest itself, quote, through the commanding apparatus of the army, end quote. But its contents would be that of a, quote, victorious bourgeois counter-revolution, end quote, carried out by the, quote, new property holders, end quote. Trotsky. The Danger of Bonapartism, published in The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1928 to 1929, published with Pathfinder Press, 1981. Bonapartism, for Trotsky's purposes, was simply the establishment of capitalism decorated with the phraseology of the French Revolution. Gone is the Marxist notion of it as an independent state power rising above all classes, including the kulak bourgeoisie. In the next few years, it became clear that neither the right nor the military, and least of all the peasantry, had emerged supreme. Stalin supporters, and the bureaucratic state had. Trotsky struggled to adjust himself to the new reality. Trotsky now attempted to attach the label, quote, Bonapartist to the Stalinist state itself, and in the process redefine the concept yet again. Now, 1935, quote, the resemblance between the present Soviet political regime and the regime of the first consul, end quote, was blindingly obvious. This was because the Soviet state, previously regulating the antagonism between workers and peasants, had now risen above both classes. Footnote. See Trotsky, The Worker State, Thermidor, and Bonapartism, published in the Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1934-35. End footnote. Trotsky had changed his characterization of Bonapartism, which had previously represented the restoration of capitalism, to one of an independent state power for a particular reason. If Stalinism was Bonapartism, and if Bonapartism was an independent state power, then Trotsky could argue that the class basis of the Soviet state, which Trotsky maintained was still a worker state of sorts, had not changed, just as the triumph of Napoleon had not rolled back the gains of the French Revolution, of the French bourgeoisie. Furthermore, in 1935, Trotsky was forced to emphasize the, quote, independent state side of the argument, since the, quote, peasant support side had been utterly destroyed when the supposedly Bonapartist Soviet regime had turned on the peasantry in the campaign for forced collectivization. In other words, Trotsky's concept of Bonapartism had moved from one in which the peasant support was everything and the independent state nothing, Bonapartism is the restoration of capitalism, to one in which the independent state entirely eclipsed the need for peasant support, Bonapartism is Stalinism, New section, Stalinism and Bonapartism. A more satisfactory account of Stalinism and Stalinism's perennial fear of Bonapartism can be achieved, I think, if it starts from the relationship between the forces of production and the production relations in the early Soviet Union. The relationship of the relations of production to productive forces is, generally speaking, a functional one. That is to say, there is a tendency for the productive forces to develop, and production relations arise which allow that tendency to proceed most efficiently. If the production relations start to impede the development of the productive forces, they are, eventually, changed or destroyed. Footnote. This kind of orthodox historical materialism is defended eloquently by G.A. Cohen in Karl Marx's Theory of History, published in 1991, and refined in History, Labor, and Freedom, published in 1988. I guess that's the first edition. I guess that was a second edition of Karl Marx's Theory of History. Anyway, end footnote. As I have argued elsewhere, the state is part of the production relations. Footnote. See Lockwood, Destruction of the Soviet Union. As I have argued elsewhere, the state is part of the production relations. A set of production relations in which the state is dominant, that is, a state-run economy, will develop the productive forces, otherwise it would not survive for very long, but it will do so in a particular direction. Given the origin of states and their prime directive, defense and expansion, state-dominated production relations will develop the productive forces towards the preparation for war. Such a society will be dominated by building up its resources for successful defense and by designing its economy to that end. It will be concerned with securing its borders and with arranging its international relations to put itself in the best defensible position. Thus, the Soviet Union, as an example of this phenomenon, can be classified as a war economy. As such, the Soviet state was driven to establish the economic basis on which to build up its armed forces as rapidly and efficiently as possible. The evolution of the Soviet Union into a war economy began well before Stalin, strongly influenced by a number of contingent factors. The 1917 revolution took place in the generally militarized atmosphere of the First World War, the first total war, depending on mass mobilization and the militarization of the warring economies. Furthermore, socialism itself had become somewhat mesmerized by the efficiency and state domination of, quote, Kriegssozialismus, end quote. War socialism. Since the war heralded the collapse of capitalism, socialists reasoned that the most advanced economies then existing, the German war economy, for example, must have some resemblance to the future socialist economy. As Lenin put it, quote, socialism is merely the next step forward from state capitalist monopoly, end quote. Lenin. If only the kind of deep state intervention represented by the German war economy could be placed under a revolutionary government, under, quote, Soviet power, end quote, for example, then according to Lenin, quote, it would be 3/4 of socialism, end quote. Lenin to the All-Russian CEC, 29th of April, 1918. The revolution itself had a decidedly military character. In November 1917, there were 2 Russian economies, urban and rural, consequently 2 revolutions, a grab for land by the peasantry on the one hand, and an urban-based utopian vision of, quote, socialism on the other. The bridge between the two was the soldiers, radicalized by the urban revolution and transmitting it into the demands of the peasantry. The urban Soviets were dominated by the soldiers' representatives. In Petrograd, for example, 800 workers' delegates sat alongside nearly 2,000 representatives of the soldiers and sailors. The Menshevik leader, Raphael R. Abramovich, noted the role of the soldiers in the actual power seizure. Quote, in brief, the, quote, proletarian revolution, end quote, was accomplished while the working masses of the capital stood by passively. Was won by war-weary peasant lads in soldiers' or sailors' uniforms, end quote. Raphael R. Abramovich. The Soviet Revolution, 1917 to 1939, published in 1962. Within a few months, the Soviet government was embroiled in a full-scale civil war, the prosecution of which necessitated the building of a war economy. This is the period of, quote, war communism, end quote, of desperate measures and military methods. Footnote, for a hymn of praise to these methods, see Leon Trotsky, The Defense of Terrorism. End footnote. For many Bolsheviks, it was a period of great optimism, since the increasing role of the Soviet state and the enforced egalitarianism of the war economy seemed to be creating a kind of, quote, socialism before their very eyes. Partly because of this, and partly to bolster enthusiasm for the new regime, the Bolshevik leaders were soon throwing caution to the winds and predicting socialism in Russia sooner rather than later. Footnote, See Lenin's speech to the joint CEC/TUC session, published in Collected Works, Volume 27. Program of the Russian Communist Party, March 1919, in Nikolai Bukharin and Evgeny Preobrazhensky, The ABC of Communism, 9th Russian Communist Party Congress, in R. Grigor's edited volume, Resolutions and Decisions of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Volume 2. End footnote. Quote, socialism, then, became identified with a war economy and a militarized state. The new economic policy from 1921 to 1928 was a temporary retreat from war economics. Eventually, however, the NEP threatened the security of the Soviet state by engendering capitalism in agriculture and to a lesser extent in trade and commerce. As such, it produced considerable resentment within the party and the state, not least from the Red Army elite, which objected to the social consequences of the NEP, as well as to the move away from a militarized economy which gave first priority to national defense. Footnote. See Mark von Hagen, Soldiers in the Proletarian Dictatorship, the Red Army and the Soviet Socialist State, 1917 to 1930, published in 1990. See also Anne E. Gorsuch's article, NEP Be Damned, published in the Russian Review, 1997. End footnote. Stalin himself noted that, quote, now we have the NEP, we have permitted a revival of capitalism, ... we are being enveloped in a new atmosphere by the nascent and growing bourgeoisie, end quote. Stalin, the party's tasks, published in Stalin's Works, Volume 7. In terms of the state's need to defend itself both internally and externally, the NEP was not simply inefficient, it was positively dangerous. It gave comfort to the state's enemies in the countryside and could not provide the wherewithal to deter its enemies abroad. For food, exports, industrialization, and defense, agricultural production had to be forced up. Given the state of the economy, this could only be achieved by draconian methods. In 1928, with power of the administration and the army firmly in its hands, the state elite, now gathered around Stalin, put paid to its enemies of the left and the right, and moved back to a version of the war economy based on collectivized agriculture and rapid industrialization. The state consolidated its domination over the production relations, and in so doing maintained and expanded the military nature of the Soviet economy. Stalinism, then, was the final form of state-dominated production relations in Russia, shaped by Russian history and the Soviet experience. Of Marx's two conditions for Bonapartism, it certainly fulfilled one. The state, the political, economic, and military bureaucracy, was elevated above other classes and operated, within the Soviet system, as an independent and commanding force. State predilections being what they are, this accounts for the ever-present military trappings of the Stalinist regime. But what of the second condition? Stalinism was not based on the support of the peasantry. It is true that Stalin achieved much of his influence between 1924 and 1928 as an apparent supporter of the new economic policy and of Bukharin's policy of leniency toward the kulak. Bukharin and the right, however, were the real representatives of the peasant interest at this time. But in 1929, Stalin turned on the peasantry in a concerted campaign to destroy the peasantry. And behind Stalin we find not peasants, but the state bureaucracy. Stalinism was a different kind of state domination from Bonapartism, yet the former still feared the latter. What made the fear such a perennial force? New section, Stalinism and the military. In order to maintain its military competitiveness vis-a-vis other states, the Soviet regime was forced not only to devote a large section of the economy to military production and development, but to cultivate the military hierarchy itself. Periodically, it had to encourage the Red Army's most talented, which often meant their most independent, leaders, and to lionize them in society at large. Thus were produced the many, quote, personality cults, end quote, around various Soviet military leaders, Budeny, Voroshilov, and, for a time, Tukhachevsky, and Blyucher? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Yet periodically the most talented military leaders were cut down and in the process accused of Bonapartism. Roman Kolkovich suggested that the party leadership and the Red Army command were in constant conflict. The army leadership, he said, quote, seek to dissociate themselves from the party's apparatus and its controls, to cultivate their own professional and institutional values, and to remain aloof from politics and the larger society, end quote. The party struggled to maintain its own hegemony, turned these military interests into a potential challenge. Therefore, the party/army relationship was, quote, conflict-prone. The party had a simultaneous relationship of need and fear towards the Red Army command. For the party, the armed forces were vital for the survival of their state, but also dangerous to it. They had to be built up and contained at the same time. Thus, on the one hand, the Soviet regime pursued policies, both internally and externally, which required substantial military power. On the other hand, it periodically undermined the efficiency of that military power by burdening it with political controls. Overzealous containment of the military could lead to demoralization and weakness, in which case the institution would have to be built up again to withstand the next internal or external threat. Footnote. See R. Kolkovich, or Kolkovitz, I don't know how to say it. The Soviet Military and the Communist Party, published with Princeton University Press in 1967. End footnote. Although much of Kolkovich's analysis seems to me to be correct, the issues Kolkovich suggests over which the party and the army fought are in the main wrong. Kolkovich instances, among others, a tendency towards elitism, professional autonomy, and nationalism on the military side versus that of egalitarianism, subordination to ideology, and proletarian internationalism on the parties. The military side of this equation may be a description of the subjective values of some military commanders. However, the idea that the party leadership consistently strove for egalitarianism or consistent ideology or internationalism strikes me as exceedingly dubious. At the same time, the Soviet regime was at no stage consistently opposed to elitism or nationalism. I would argue that the party/army conflict did not arise out of the subjective wishes or ambitions of a military caste that wanted more power and consequently less political control. Such wishes or ambitions may or may not have existed and may have motivated some officers at some times and not others. But the conflict was a continual conflict. It arose because the party leadership, and behind it the war economy, and behind that productive force development, demanded the most efficient military machine possible. As war became increasingly technologically complex, efficiency increasingly pointed towards military control of military affairs, the replacement of the party's political objectives with purely military objectives. Subjectively, the military was not for the most part at odds with the party leadership. In fact, it was precisely because it agreed with the party on national objectives, because 80% of armed forces personnel were members of the party or the Komsomol, that it was dedicated to a more efficient and effective military force. Footnote. See Roman Kolkovitz's Toward a Theory of Civil-Military Relations in Communist, hegemonial, systems, and Roman Kolkovich and Andrei Korbansky's edited volume, Soldiers, Peasants, and Bureaucrats, Civil-Military Relations in Communist and Modernizing Societies, published in 1982. End footnote. That dedication, however, because it would ultimately have meant an end to political control, brought the army commanders into conflict with the political leadership. The process was an objective process which continued regardless of the personalities involved. Within it, the fortunes of the military ebbed and flowed. When the state was under threat, military power was at a premium, and the power of the commanders advanced. When the threat lessened, and/or the potential challenge of the military could no longer be tolerated, that power was thrown back. On this basis, we can understand some of the history of the party/army relationship under Stalin and the accusations of Bonapartism that accompanied it. New section, the historical record. Early Soviet military history illustrates the process, as does the rise and fall of a series of military leaders. From early in the Civil War, the Soviet leadership was divided over the use of, quote, military specialists, end quote, that is, former Imperial Army officers, in the Red Army, and the implications that this had for the sort of army that would emerge. Those most intent on military proficiency rather than political correctness, such as Trotsky, firmly endorsed the specialist role, and were sternly criticized for this in left party circles. Footnote. See von Hagen, Soldiers in the Proletarian Dictatorship. I'm looking for a piece that specifically focuses on the military opposition, but I haven't really found one yet. Anyway, and footnote. In this, Trotsky was supported even by those who envisaged a more political role for the army as a vanguard of the world revolution, since they understood that for such an army, a proficient and professional corps was essential. Footnote. See Tukhachevsky on the subject. Those inclined to an army firmly under political control, such as Stalin and Voroshilov, both former commissars of the Southern Front Revolutionary Military Council in 1918, distrusted the specialists intensely and led the attack on their supporters. One of the earliest Soviet military leaders was Mikhail Frunze, who led the charge on behalf of the emerging Red Army military commanders in the military debates at the 10th and 11th Party Congresses in 1921 and 1922. Mikhail Frunze's arguments against a militia system for the armed forces and in favor of a proper military command and hierarchy were temporarily defeated at that time. However, such was the disorganization of the army in the wake of the Civil War that the Central Committee ordered an investigation into the mess in June 1923. Given the composition of the investigation commission, it included Frunze, Voroshilov, Ordzhonikidze, and Kyubyshev, it was hardly a surprise that it laid the blame for the situation at Trotsky's door. After two more commissions, Frunze was made deputy chairman of the Revolutionary Military Soviet in March 1924. He replaced Trotsky as chairman and People's Commissar for War in January 1925. With the strong support of Stalin, Frunze moved to put his ideas on military reform into effect. The professionalism of the officer corps, stricter discipline, and the weakening of civilian (including party) and control. Footnote. See Stalin to C.C. Plenum, 19th of January 1925, published in his Works, Volume 7. See Raymond S. Zweiter, Soviet Military Reform in the 20th Century, published in 1992. Mark von Hagen's article, Civil-Military Relations and the Evolution of the Soviet Socialist State, published in Slavic Review, 1991. And John Erickson's book, The Soviet High Command, A Military Political History, 1918 to 1941. End footnote. The powers of the political commissars, the party's instrument within the armed forces, were phased out. Footnote. Directive number 234, 19th of January 1925, published in Erickson, Soviet High Command. Stephen Main's article, The Red Army and the Soviet Military and Political Leadership in the Late 1920s, the case of the, quote, inner army opposition of 1928, end quote. Published in Europe Asia Studies, 1995, end footnote. In support of these moves, Frunze argued that the Soviet Union was, quote, a besieged stronghold, end quote, and that between it and the capitalist countries there could only be a, quote, state of long, stubborn, deep war to the death, end quote. Therefore, quote, the country's energy and will must be directed toward the creation and fortification of our military might, end quote. Footnote. Mikhail Frunze, a unified military doctrine for the Red Army, 1921, published in Harriet and William Scott's edited volume, The Soviet Art of War, published in 1982, end footnote. Frunze was a serious militarizer. For Frunze, the preparation for a total war with capitalist states meant not only strengthening the army, but the militarization of the population as a whole. This meant that Frunze was increasingly antagonistic towards political interference. Frunze was, toward the end of his career, quote, being very gradually but finally militarized out of his communism, end quote, in Erickson's words. We can only speculate as to whether Frunze's evolving ideas on the necessity of military independence brought Frunze into conflict with the party leadership. In October 1925, Frunze died as the result of an operation which he was unwilling to have, but which the Politburo instructed him to undergo. Some accused Stalin and his supporters of hastening the demise of an inconvenient (and potentially dangerous) military leader in this way. Footnote. See A.A. Kokoshin, something in German. Russian. See also something by V.D. Topolyansky in Russian, and also Trotsky's Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence. End footnote. Whether or not this was true, the fact that Boris Pilniak earned a severe reprimand by publishing a supposedly fictional story along these lines in 1926 seems to indicate a broad awareness of the party/military antagonism at this time. Footnote: see E. H. Carr's article, Pilniak and the Death of Frunze, published in Soviet Studies 1958, end footnote. At any rate, the strong position of the military commanders was whittled away in the wake of Frunze's death, and the political commissars were returned, not for the last time, to a position of dual command with their military counterparts. In terms of the threat of war, the reassertion of party control after Frunze's death reflected a lull before the storm. The 1827 war scare, which envisaged military threats from Poland and Britain exacerbated by the defeat of the Communist Party in China, Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the Nazi seizure of power in 1933 all contributed to a threatening prospect for the Soviet state. Once again, then, the military command was brought back into favor. This was reflected in the career of Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a prominent military leader both in the Civil War and the war against Poland. Tukhachevsky commented frequently on military affairs. Tukhachevsky was a militarizer on the Frunze model, and his experience in Poland appeared to convince Tukhachevsky that the world revolution could be carried forward on the bayonets of the Red Army. By 1828, Tukhachevsky was advocating both a strengthening of the Red Army command staff, militarily and economically, and a program of massive and headlong military industrialization. Tukhachevsky's proposals on army administration were turned down by the Revolutionary Military Soviet in that year. Yet curiously, only 18 months or so later, in early 1930, a system of administration much like the one Tukhachevsky had advocated was adopted. Footnote: see David R. Stone's article, Tukhachevsky in Leningrad, Military Politics and Exile, 1928-31. End footnote. Who the hell am I? Perhaps this is not so curious when it is placed in the context of the threatening international situation. Even more dramatic was the career of Tukhachevsky's militarization proposals. In 1930, Tukhachevsky proposed within military circles a massive expansion of the armed forces, especially in tanks and airplanes, to be achieved by the, quote, storming methods, end quote, of the five-year plan extended into defense production. It was vital, Tukhachevsky said, that the expansion take place by the end of the plan period. Tukhachevsky was rebuffed by the General Staff, who argued that Soviet economic resources were simply inadequate to fulfill his ambitions. Voroshilov took the precaution of sending in March 1930 a copy of the proposal to Stalin, who described them as, quote, fantastic, and concluded, quote, to, quote, realize such a plan would mean without fail to destroy both the national economy and the army, end quote. Stalin. Nevertheless, Stalin had changed his mind by 1932. In May of 1932, Stalin informed Tukhachevsky that his previous judgment had been too harsh, that he now agreed with him on the size and strength of the armed forces that was required. The forces at the disposal of the Red Army duly expanded, which meant not only an improvement in the career prospects of Tukhachevsky himself, he became the virtual commander of the Red Army, but a substantial increase in the power and social standing of the Red Army commanders as a whole. Military hierarchy and the privileges of command were reinforced from 1935 onwards. There can be no doubt that the changed position of the Soviet leadership and its now benevolent attitude towards the military resulted from an increased threat of war. Perhaps less well known is the case of Vasily Blyuker, the military strongman of the Soviet Far East. Blyuker had distinguished himself in the Civil War and was appointed to the command of the armed forces of the short-lived Far Eastern Republic in 1921. He was recalled from that post in 1922 and sometime after that sent a chief military advisor to the Kuomintang forces in southern China operating under the nom de guerre Gelen. Displaying the independence of mind that would get him into trouble later, he distrusted Chiang Kai-shek as a political ally, although he did not oppose the Kuomintang's northern expedition in 1926. After Chiang's wing of the Kuomintang turned on the Communist Party and its supporters in 1927, he made his way back to Russia. Blücher led the raid on the Chinese Eastern Railway, which retook it from the Chinese forces in 1929. It was as a result of these actions that the Special Far Eastern Army was formed, with Blücher in command. 2 years later, Blücher was presented with the Order of Lenin and that of the Red Banner of Voroshilov, and in 1935 he was made one of the first marshals of the Soviet Union. Blücher's rise reflected increasing tensions along the borders of the Far East and the increasingly aggressive stance of Japan. From 1929 onwards, the Special Far Eastern Army was expanded continually and rapidly in order to meet the threat gathering across the border, which, after the Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931, grew to become a virtual state of war. By the end of 1936, the Special Far Eastern Army numbered 240,000 troops, along with 900 tanks, 400 armored cars, and 1,000 aircraft. A major armed clash occurred at Changkufeng in August 1938. Blücher's potential power grew accordingly. The buildup in the Far East was not only a military phenomenon. If the Soviet Far East was to be made defensible against a determined enemy, it had to have the economic ability to defend itself independently of Moscow. The first 5-year plan indicated an attempt to achieve economic self-sufficiency and an armaments base for the Far East. Stalin mentioned the need of the region in his report to the 16th Party Congress in 1930. Defense necessitated an industrial base and a growing population which could develop a self-sufficient economic unit. This was clearly Blücher's aim. Footnote. See Jonathan Haslam's Soviet Foreign Policy 1930-33, published in 1983. See James Forsyth's book, A History of the Peoples of Siberia, Russia's North Asian Colony, 1581 to 1990. End footnote. Given his background and the enormous power now concentrated in his hands, it would have been uncharacteristic of the political leadership not to have regarded the Far Eastern Marshal as a threat. In late 1930, there were rumors that Blücher had been arrested. He reemerged, however, in mid-1931. Given the unfolding military situation, Moscow was not yet in a position to act. Frunze, Tukhachevsky, and Blücher were they potential Bonapartes? Certainly, they met Marx's first condition for Bonapartism. Had they reached for power, they would have raised the power of the state above all classes representing, as Marx described the military, the, quote, purest expression of, quote, the executive power, end quote. But what of the second condition, the support of the peasantry? There is no evidence that either Frunze or Tukhachevsky was particularly pro-peasant. Indeed, given their extreme views on militarization and the consequent necessity for rapid industrialization, it would seem highly unlikely that they had any sympathy for the peasants' plight under the Soviet regime. Footnote. I am aware that there is a persistent story that the Red Army commanders, fearful of the damage to morale that forced collectivization inflicted on the mainly peasant soldiers, demanded that the Politburo slacken the pace in early 1930. See, for example, Haslam's Soviet Foreign Policy, Davies, von Hagen, etc. Unfortunately, for it would have fitted neatly into my argument, despite archival research at RGVA and RGASPI in December 1999, I could find no evidence for such a tale. Sources for it remain British and Italian diplomats and French security agents. End footnote. Blücher, however, may have been another question entirely. Several accounts relate that he extracted concessions from the Center for the Far Eastern Peasantry on the grounds of military necessity. Most agree that this was in 1933. Footnote. See Eric Wollenberg's The Red Army, A Study of the Growth of Soviet Imperialism, published in 1973, parenthesis, 1940, in parenthesis. Leonard Shapiro's article, The Great Purge, in B.H. Liddell Hart's edited volume, The Soviet Army, published in 1956. See Forsyth, History of the Peoples of Siberia, Deutscher's Stalin. McIntosh says that it occurred, quote, at the height of the Japanese threats in the Far East, end quote. See J.M. McIntosh's article, The Red Army, 1920 to 1936, in Liddell Hart's edited volume, Soviet Army. The concessions probably explain Blyucher's reference to the exceptionally wise decision of the leadership on, quote, privileges for Far Eastern farmers in his speech to the Seventh Party Congress. End footnote. Whether this was the cause or not, the increasing war threat in the 1930s, together with the rise in self-assertion of both Tukhachevsky and Blyucher, took place against the background of continuing peasant unhappiness with the collectivization of agriculture. Footnote. See Sheila Fitzpatrick's book, Stalin's Peasants, published in 1994. End footnote. Both of the military leaders were at one with the party leadership in terms of national goals, military defense, and so on. The problem was that those very goals pushed them towards a military that was independent of political control. The party leadership may have reasoned that any further development of military strength and independence may have connected with peasant unrest. It was better, even in the strategic circumstance of the late 1930s, to crush unconscious Bonapartism than to allow it to fester. It is also possible that by 1937 the military situation in European Russia did not appear quite so threatening as before. The kulaks had been liquidated, industrialization was more or less on track, and yesterday's enemies, Britain, France, and Poland, appeared weak, albeit in the face of the greater threat of Nazi Germany. At any rate, the party leadership decided that it was time once again to clip the wings of the armed forces by striking a decisive blow at Tukhachevsky and Tukhachevsky's group. At the infamous February-March plenum of the Central Committee in 1937, called to discuss the impending purge, Voroshilov suggested optimistically that, quote, in the RKKA, up to now, fortunately or unfortunately, parenthesis, and I think very fortunately, in parenthesis, there has not been revealed especially many enemies of the people, end quote. Voroshilov. However, those that had been revealed had, quote, settled in the commanding ranks, end quote. Footnote. See Oleg F. Suvenirov, The People's Commissariat of Defense in the NKVD during the pre-war years, published in Russian Studies in History, 1992. End footnote. In May, the political commissars were restored to dual command with military officers, and arrests of army personnel began. By the following year, the Special Department of the NKVD in the Red Army was able to report the discovery of over 40 conspiratorial groups within the armed forces. From the 1st to the 4th of June 1937, the Military Soviet of the Defense Commissariat met and presented with Yazov's report on counter-revolutionaries within the Red Army. Tukhachevsky, along with 7 of his closest supporters, including Gamarnik, who committed suicide, was arrested on the 22nd of May. Their trial ended on the 11th of June, and they were shot the following day. Many arrests and executions preceded the Tukhachevsky trial, and many more were to follow. Voroshilov noted to himself in June 1937, quote, the authority of the army in the country has been shaken, ... The authority of the command personnel has been undermined, end quote. Voroshilov. This, of course, was precisely the party's intention. The situation in the Far East presented more of a problem. Continuing tension among the Manchurian borders stayed the hand of Stalin and Stalin's supporters, at least as far as Blyucher himself was concerned. His position, however, was undermined both organizationally and from below. The Special Far Eastern Army was weakened by various reorganizations in 1937. The Trans-Baikal garrisons were separated and the Kolkhoz Corps disbanded at the end of the year. The army would be split into 3 parts. At the same time, arrests were carried out amongst railway personnel and then amongst the military command and political staffs. In fact, the largest number of commanding officers dismissed or arrested up until November 1937 came from the Special Far Eastern Army. The process was temporarily halted when actual military conflict with the Japanese broke out in the Amur region in July 1938. To that point, the Far East Purge had not touched Blyucher at all, publicly at least. To all intents and purposes, he was still a favorite of the party leadership. At a Central Committee meeting in October 1937, having detailed the arrest of members and candidate members, Stalin proposed a number of names to be elevated to Central Committee membership. Blyucher's was amongst them, which pointed out that the, quote, party and the government have entrusted to Marshal of the Soviet Union, V.K. Blyucher, the guardianship of our far eastern borders, end quote. However, in the midst of the fighting with the Japanese around Lake Khasan in August 1938, Blyucher was summoned to Moscow and relieved of his command. He died there under interrogation in November. The skirmish with Japan had been important enough to interrupt the party leadership's reassertion of authority over the military in the Far East, but it was not enough to stop it altogether. New section. A plot? ? Was there a military plot to dislodge the Stalinist leadership? For Soviet purposes, its existence was established not only by the announcement of the military trial and executions, but by copious amounts of testimony at the trial of the, quote, block of Rights and Trotskyites, the Bukharin-Rykov trial, in March 1938. Footnote. See the testimony of Basanov, Rykov, Krestinsky, Rosengold, and Bukharin in Report of the Court Proceedings, Block of Rights and Trotskyites, end footnote. Some contemporary accounts from outside the Soviet Union also accepted a version of Tukhachevsky as Bonaparte. In later years, Isaac Deutscher declared that plans for a military coup were afoot and that Tukhachevsky was its leader. Footnote. See Deutscher's Stalin. As for Blyucher, the Far Eastern commander of the NKVD, Genrikh Lyushkov, who defected to the Japanese, told his interrogators that although the Far Eastern military conspiracy revolved around Jan Gamarnik, head of the Red Army's political administration, Blyucher was certainly involved. Footnote. See Alvin D. Cook's article L'Affaire Lyushkov, Anatomy of a Defector, published in Soviet Studies, 1968. And footnote. Much of this speculation, however, misses the point. The military were cut down not for what they had done, but for what the party leadership believed they were capable of doing. That capability had been built up by the Soviet regime itself in its desperation to build at sufficient speed, a war machine capable of withstanding military threats in Europe and the Far East. The natural tendency of the Soviet war economy was to increase the powers of those most directly concerned with making war. As such, that tendency had to be obstructed forcibly by the party if it were to maintain its power. The Stalinist leaders had to read their marks. They recognized the threat of Bonapartism proceeding from the same 2 sources to which Marx and Engels had pointed, the discontent of the peasantry and the rising power of the military. Having successfully destroyed one, they proceeded to destroy the other. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.